Millionaire sees construction worker feeding his disabled son and his life changes forever. Richard Thompson watched from a distance, his expression puzzled, as a construction worker carefully fed a boy in a wheelchair at the site of his newest luxury development in Greenwich, Connecticut. Something about that scene unsettled him deeply, as if a distant memory were trying to surface. It was when the boy smiled that Richard felt his heart race. That smile, it was identical to Rebecca's, his ex-wife, who had left him 8 years ago while pregnant. The businessman, known for his cold demeanor in the corporate world, couldn't hide the trembling in his hands. "Who is that man with the boy in the wheelchair?" he asked the lead engineer accompanying him on the site visit. "That's Lewis, one of our best workers. The boy is his son, Ethan. A remarkable kid, very bright. Lewis brings him to work because he has no one to leave him with." "The mother?" "Well, she's no longer in the picture," the engineer replied, oblivious to the pallor spreading across Richard's face. The businessman tried to maintain his composure, but couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The tenderness with which the calloused-handed man fed the boy contrasted sharply with the rough, noisy construction site. There was a devotion there that Richard, at 47, had never experienced. "Does he always bring the boy?" Richard pressed, trying to sound casual. "Almost every day. Lewis works 2 jobs, you know. Mornings here, nights as a security guard. He turned down a foreman position because the hours wouldn't let him care for the boy properly. He's a dedicated father." Richard cut the visit short. On the way to his luxurious penthouse in the Upper East Side, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Could it be? Or was it just a cruel twist of fate? At home, he opened his safe and pulled out the box he'd sworn never to look at again. Inside, among important documents, was an old photo album with pictures of Rebecca. The last photo of them together showed a radiant Rebecca, her belly just beginning to show at 3 months pregnant. It had been Christmas Eve when she left, leaving only a note saying she couldn't go on with that life. Richard had always assumed she'd gone abroad and terminated the pregnancy. He never imagined the child could have been born, could be alive, and right there at his construction site, being cared for by a simple laborer. That night the businessman couldn't sleep. Images of the boy in the wheelchair blended with memories of Rebecca. The next day, Richard did something he'd never done before. He cancelled all his meetings and returned to the site unannounced. From afar, he watched the worker interact with the boy again. Ethan must have been about 7, he guessed. The timing was perfect. With a lump in his throat, Richard realized he'd never envied anyone as much as he did that humble man sharing his lunch with the boy. The following week was spent in quiet investigation. Richard hired the best private investigator in New York City, Michael Reynolds, and demanded absolute discretion. "I want everything about them. How the boy ended up with that worker if there's an adoption record, who the biological mother is. Everything," he ordered, handing over an envelope with a generous advance. While waiting for the results, Richard devised a way to get closer. He announced a new benefits program for employees with special needs children. The first recipient would, coincidentally, be Louis and his son, Ethan. The company's social worker, Mrs. Wilson, was sent to conduct the initial evaluation at Louis's modest home in Queens, in the northern part of New York City. Richard requested a detailed report, which arrived 2 days later and left him even more unsettled. The home is simple, but extremely organized and clean. Ethan's room is adapted with great care, featuring a hospital bed likely bought second-hand, but in perfect condition. There are drawings on the walls, plenty of books and educational games. Louis keeps a notebook with all the medical instructions, medications, and physical therapy details. There's a folder with impressive drawings by the boy, showing remarkable artistic talent. According to neighbors, Louis took over raising Ethan about 3 years ago when the original adoptive family returned him upon discovering his neurological condition, which, in addition to paralysis in his lower limbs, includes occasional seizures. Richard reread the report several times. Returned him upon discovering his condition. The words hit him like a punch. What had happened? Why had Rebecca given their son up for adoption? And how had he ended up with Louis? The answer came a week later when Michael, the investigator, delivered his full report. Along with it, he brought copies of documents that left no doubt Ethan was indeed his biological son. Rebecca had given the baby up for adoption right after birth through a legal process. The first adoptive family was a middle-class couple from Pittsburgh, Michael explained. When the boy was about 3.5, he began showing the first neurological symptoms. The diagnosis came soon after, a rare degenerative condition affecting motor coordination and potentially causing occasional seizures. With proper treatment, he could live a practically normal life, but he'd need constant care. The couple wasn't prepared for that, and they returned him like a defective product. Richard finished, his voice choked. Basically, yes. The boy went back into the adoption system, but with his condition, his chances were slim. That's when this construction worker, Lewis Miller, stepped in. He was already volunteering at the shelter where Ethan was staying and had formed a special bond with the boy. Even though he was single and had limited means, he fought in court for the right to adopt him. He got temporary custody first, then full custody. From what I've gathered, he's an exemplary man, Richard. Ethan was lucky. Richard stayed silent for several long minutes. There's one more thing, Michael continued. Louis saves every penny for an experimental treatment that could help Ethan walk again. There's a clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, developing a promising therapy, but it costs a fortune. He's already sold the only car he had and works overtime, whenever possible. That night, Richard cried for the first time in many years. He cried for the son he'd never known, for the pain Ethan must have felt being returned, and knowing a stranger was doing for Ethan what he, as the biological father, had never had the chance to do. The next morning, he made a decision. He would create a foundation for children with the same condition as Ethan, and the first beneficiary would be his own son, without anyone knowing the true connection between them. Through the newly founded foundation, Richard funded the experimental treatment for Ethan, along with 10 other children in the same situation, enough to avoid raising suspicions. He also offered Louis a full scholarship for Ethan to attend the best adaptive school in the city, as part of the company's benefits program. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The following months were transformative for Richard. Discreetly, he followed Ethan's progress through the Foundation's reports. The boy was responding exceptionally well to the treatment. His drawing skills, especially for architectural plans and structures, impressed all the professors. Richard created opportunities to visit the construction site more frequently, gradually building a friendly relationship with Louis, always under the pretext of monitoring the company's social program. During one of these visits, he saw Ethan sketching what appeared to be a building. "What are you drawing, Ethan?" Richard asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "It's the building you're constructing, but with some changes," the boy replied with a professional seriousness that drew smiles from everyone around. Richard took the drawing and was amazed. For a 7-year-old, it was extraordinary. What struck him most, however, was that Ethan had altered the building's facade, incorporating elements Richard himself had initially considered, but abandoned due to cost. "Do you like buildings?" Richard asked, trying to contain his emotion. "I'm going to be an architect when I grow up," Ethan declared with conviction. "I'll build special homes for people like me with cool ramps and elevators." At that moment, something shattered inside Richard. It was as if all the walls he'd built over the years to protect his heart were crumbling at once. "He's got talent, doesn't he?" Louis remarked, stepping closer with visible pride. "Sometimes I lie awake wondering where all this intelligence comes from. It certainly didn't come from me. I barely finished high school." The innocent comment struck Richard like an arrow. From me, he thought. He got it from me. His own mother had been an architect, one of the first women to excel in the profession in the United States during the 1960s. The calling had skipped a generation and manifested in Ethan. Richard deepened his involvement, careful not to arouse suspicion. He invited Louis and Ethan to visit the construction company's main office, where Ethan was awestruck by the models and blueprints. He even instituted a Bring Your Kids to Work Day at the company, allowing Ethan to blend in naturally with other children. Every interaction revealed something new about this little person who carried his genes. Things seemed to be going well until Rebecca, his ex-wife, returned to the United States after 8 years abroad. Richard learned through mutual friends that she was in New York City, apparently to settle matters related to her late parents' estate. Their reunion was inevitable and took place during a charity event organized by mutual friends. Rebecca was thinner, her hair shorter, and her eyes carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk, Richard," she said after the formal greetings. They met the next day at a discreet cafe in Soho. It was then that Rebecca finally shared her version of the story. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was happy at first. You must remember," she began, "but in the 4th month, tests detected abnormalities. The doctors told me our son would have serious neurological issues. He'd likely never walk normally. I tried to tell you so many times, but you were completely absorbed in that project in Washington, D.C. Remember, the biggest contract of your career, you called it." Richard remembered, the project that catapulted him to the top of the U.S. real estate market. "When I finally got your attention to discuss the test results, you were so exhausted you barely listened. But you said something I'll never forget. If this project falls through, we're finished. We don't need any more problems right now." The next day, you flew back to Washington, D.C. Rebecca paused to discreetly wipe away a tear. "I knew you too well, Richard. I knew how obsessed you were with perfection, how any obstacle seemed unbearable to you. I imagined how you would react to a child who would require special care, who wouldn't be the perfect heir you always mentioned, wanting. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided our son deserved a family that would fully accept him, not a father who would see him as a problem." Richard felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. "You had no right to assume my reaction, Rebecca. He was my son too." "Was I wrong? Would you have welcomed a child with disabilities with open arms, the Richard from 8 years ago?" The question hung between them like a silent accusation. Richard knew the answer, but couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. The man he was 8 years ago would likely have seen it as a problem to be solved, not a child to be loved unconditionally. "Why didn't you just have an abortion then?" he asked, with more bitterness than he intended. "Because I loved him, even without ever having met him. But I knew I couldn't raise him alone, not with the complications that would come, so I chose adoption, working with an agency that would find parents ready to love him completely." Rebecca took a deep breath. "I never imagined he'd be sent back." "You know about that?" Richard was surprised. "I've kept discreet contact with the adoption agency. I know he's with a man named Louis now, a construction worker from what I've heard. Seems like a good man." "He is," Richard confirmed, to Rebecca's surprise. "Our son is being very well cared for." Then Richard told her about the extraordinary coincidence that had brought Ethan to his construction site, how he'd been quietly watching his progress, and about the foundation he'd created to fund his treatment. "I suppose fate has a peculiar sense of humor," Rebecca concluded with a sad smile. "Of all the construction companies in New York City, Louis ended up working for yours." The day after meeting Rebecca, Richard decided it was time to do more. He wasn't content just being an anonymous benefactor anymore. He wanted to be actively involved in Ethan's life, even if he could never reveal he was his biological father. The opportunity came when the head engineer mentioned Louis was looking for a more affordable apartment for Ethan, something with fewer stairs and closer to the physical therapy clinic. Richard happened to have an older property in Park Slope, Brooklyn, with ground floor units fully adapted for accessibility. Through HR, he offered one of these apartments to Louis at a symbolic rate, as part of a supposed new housing program for employees. Louis, proud at first, refused. But when he visited the apartment and saw how much easier it would make Ethan's life, he eventually accepted, on the condition that a small monthly amount be deducted from his salary. Richard agreed, knowing that amount would never actually be taken. The move to the new apartment brought Richard even closer to Ethan's life. The building was just 4 blocks from his penthouse in the Upper East Side, and Richard began visiting regularly, always with some excuse about building maintenance. One sunny Saturday, he found Ethan and Louis at the adaptive park in front of the complex, another happy coincidence planned by Richard. The boy was showing remarkable progress with his walker, thanks to the treatment he'd been receiving. "Mr. Richard," Ethan exclaimed when he saw him, "look what I can do now." With impressive determination, Ethan took 3 steps using only the walker, without Louis's help. His eyes shone with pride at his achievement. "That's amazing, Ethan," Richard replied, his throat tightening as he fought back tears. "The doctor said he might soon start training with crutches," explained Louis, beaming. "This treatment the foundation is providing is a miracle. I never imagined we could come this far. Maybe one day I won't even need the wheelchair anymore," added Ethan, with the unshakable optimism that never failed to impress Richard. That afternoon in the park changed something fundamental in Richard. Watching his biological son fight so hard to take a few steps, he realized how much his own life had been built on distorted values. The ambition that had consumed him for decades suddenly felt hollow compared to Ethan's genuine joy over something as simple as taking 3 steps. That night, after returning home, Richard did something he never imagined he'd do. He sent an email to his board of directors announcing he would take a 3-month leave for personal matters. He who had never taken more than a week of vacation in his entire career. In the following weeks, Richard drastically reduced his work schedule and began frequenting the same places as Ethan: the physical therapy clinic, the park, the school, always keeping a respectful distance, but staying close enough to be a constant presence. Louis naturally began to notice this unusual interest. The situation reached a critical point during a school event for Ethan, where the boy won an award for his impressive architectural drawings. Richard was there, invited by Ethan himself, who had inexplicably developed an affection for "my dad's boss." After the ceremony, one of the teachers remarked on the similarity between Ethan's drawing style and the projects from Richard's construction company, which were displayed on a mural as examples for the students. "It's amazing how he captures the essence of your style, Mr. Thompson, almost as if it were genetic," the teacher commented innocently. The remark didn't go unnoticed by Louis, who looked from Ethan to Richard and then back at the drawings. Something seemed to click in his mind. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. As they left the school, Louis asked to speak with Richard alone. "Is there something you'd like to tell me about Ethan?" he asked directly. With a calm that barely masked the tension, Richard felt his heart race. He wasn't ready for this conversation, not yet, but he saw in Louis's eyes that there was no more delaying it. "Can we talk somewhere more private?" Richard asked. They went to a nearby cafe, leaving Ethan with one of the teachers, who kindly offered to show him some architecture books in the school library. Sitting face to face, Richard finally told the whole truth: how Rebecca had left while pregnant, how he had known nothing about Ethan's existence until seeing him at the construction site, and how he had investigated and discovered he was his biological son. "I'd understand if you're furious," Richard said after finishing his account. "I barged into your life and Ethan's without permission. But I need you to know, I never intended to take him from you. You're his father in every way that truly matters." Louis stayed silent for a long moment, processing everything he'd just heard. "You could have just shown up with a court order and taken him," he said finally, his voice controlled. "You have money, lawyers, influence. Why didn't you?" The question caught Richard off guard. Because I saw how much you love him, and how much he loves you. What right would I have to destroy that?" he answered honestly. "Besides, I'm not even sure I know how to be a father. You've already proven you do." Louis looked at Richard for a long moment, as if assessing him from a new perspective. "You've been funding his treatment all this time, haven't you? It wasn't some random foundation that selected him." Richard nodded. "And the adapted apartment and the school, was all of this planned?" "Yes," Richard admitted. "I wanted to make sure he had the best opportunities." Louis shook his head, his expression caught between gratitude and suspicion. "What do you want now? What's your plan?" "I don't have a set plan, Louis. I just know I want to be part of his life, in whatever way I can. Not to replace you, but to to help, to get to know him. The conversation was interrupted by Ethan's arrival, beaming with the architecture books his teacher had shown him. The boy immediately began talking about the buildings he wanted to design one day, completely unaware of the tension between the two men. On the way home, Louis was unusually quiet. Ethan, noticing the change in his father's demeanor, asked if something was wrong. "Just thinking about a few things, son. Nothing you need to worry about," Louis replied, forcing a smile. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Louis sat on the small balcony of the apartment with a cup of coffee, replaying the entire story in his mind. He remembered the day he met Ethan at the shelter, how withdrawn and sad the boy had been after being returned by his adoptive family. He recalled the sleepless nights when the seizures were more frequent, the fear of not being able to provide proper treatment, and the indescribable joy when Ethan first called him Dad. Louis had always known Ethan was someone else's biological child, but he never imagined he'd meet that person, let alone that it would be his boss. Fate had a peculiar sense of humor, as Richard's ex-wife had once said. The next morning, Louis made a decision. He called Richard and asked to meet again, this time without Ethan. "I've thought a lot about all this," Louis said when they met, "and I've come to a conclusion. Ethan has the right to know who you are. Not now maybe, but someday. And until then, I won't stop you from being part of his life." Richard was visibly moved. "Thank you, Louis. That means more than I can say." "But I have some conditions," the construction worker continued. "First, no trying to buy his affection with expensive gifts. Second, any big decisions about his life, we consult each other. And third, most importantly, promise you'll never disappear from his life when the initial excitement fades. Ethan's already been abandoned once. He wouldn't survive another." Louis's conditions were more than reasonable, and Richard agreed immediately. In the weeks that followed, they established an unofficial routine. Richard spent some weekends with them, taking Ethan on educational outings, always with Louis present. He helped with homework, especially assignments involving drawing and math. Meanwhile, Ethan flourished with the treatment. His mobility improved considerably, and within 4 months he could take small steps with special crutches. His architectural sketches grew increasingly sophisticated, even catching the attention of the professional architects who worked for Richard. The carefully built harmony was shaken when Victoria, Richard's girlfriend of 3 years, began questioning his frequent absences and sudden shift in priorities. "You spend more time with that boy and the construction worker than with me," she complained during dinner. "What's the real story here, Richard? You've always been obsessed with work, and now suddenly you're taking afternoons off to go to some random boy's physical therapy sessions." Richard knew he couldn't keep the secret much longer. Victoria was too smart to be satisfied with vague excuses, so he told her the truth, hoping she would understand the complexity of the situation. Victoria's reaction was worse than he anticipated. "So you have a defective son with a woman who abandoned you, and now you're trying to buy his affection after another man did all the hard work," she said with clear disdain. "Frankly, Richard, don't you think you're being manipulated? That construction worker probably saw a gold mine when he found out who you are." Victoria's words hit Richard like a slap. For the first time, he saw clearly the character of the woman he had planned to marry. The coldness with which she referred to Ethan, calling him defective, revealed a side he might have always known existed but chose to ignore. "I think it's best we end things here," Richard said, rising from the table. "You've just shown me who you really are, Victoria, and you're not someone I want to share my life with." "You'll regret this," Victoria shouted as he walked out of the restaurant. "One day you'll wake up and realize you threw away everything we built because of a crippled little bastard and a scheming construction worker." Victoria's cruel words echoed in Richard's mind all the way home. Not because he regretted ending the relationship, but because he feared that on some level she might be right about him. Was he really trying to buy Ethan's affection, compensating with money and privilege what he couldn't offer in presence and love all these years? These doubts tormented him for days, until he decided to talk to the only person who could give him an honest perspective, Louis. They met on a Sunday while Ethan was at a school activity. Richard laid out his insecurities without holding back. something he had never done with anyone. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just trying to ease my guilt," he confessed. "If I'm using my money as a substitute for the love I couldn't give before." Louis listened carefully with the same focused expression he had when solving a complicated construction problem. "Look, Richard, I'll tell you something I learned from Ethan. Intentions matter. When I first met that boy at the shelter, I also questioned whether adopting him was the right thing. I was single, with little education, working 2 jobs. What kind of life could I offer him?" Louis paused. "But what mattered wasn't the circumstances, it was the intention. I loved him and wanted to see him happy. The rest we figured out along the way." The construction worker took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Of course, your money has helped a lot. I won't pretend otherwise. Ethan's getting treatment I could never afford. He's at a school I'd only visit if I were doing renovations. But you know what he loves most about weekends with you? It's not the expensive outings or the gifts. It's when you sit together and draw. When you patiently explain how building structures work. That's priceless, Richard, and you can't buy it." Louis's words soothed Richard's insecurities. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe he might finally be doing something right. The following months brought a routine none of the 3 had ever imagined possible. Richard permanently reduced his workload, delegating more responsibilities to his executive team. Louis was promoted to a supervisory position, allowing him more flexible hours to accompany Ethan to therapy. And the boy, at the center of this unlikely family constellation, continued to surprise everyone with his progress. One particularly meaningful afternoon, during a visit to the architecture office at the construction company, Ethan met Jennifer, Richard's head architect. Impressed by the boy's drawings, she suggested he enter a statewide young talent competition. "He has something special," she later remarked to Richard, "an intuition for space that many trained professionals don't possess." With Jennifer's guidance, Ethan developed an ambitious project, a fully adapted home for people with different types of disabilities. The project, which he called Home for Everyone, incorporated innovative solutions reflecting his own experience as a wheelchair user. The big day of the competition arrived. Ethan, now using only crutches for short distances, was nervous but determined. His project was among the 10 finalists, out of over 300 participants, most much older than him. Richard and Louis sat side by side in the audience, equally anxious. When Ethan's name was announced as the junior category winner, the 2 men spontaneously embraced, their differences momentarily forgotten in shared joy. The photo of that moment, the millionaire businessman and the construction worker hugging, while Ethan proudly raised his trophy on stage, made the local papers. The unlikely trio began attracting attention. That's when investigative reporter Samantha Baker started digging deeper. Within a week, she uncovered the biological connection between Richard and Ethan and was ready to publish the full story. Before the article aired, Samantha approached Richard for comment. In a panic, he called Louis for an emergency meeting. Together, they decided it was time to tell Ethan the truth before he found out through the media. The conversation took place in the adapted apartment's living room, with both men present. Ethan, now nearly 9 years old, listened silently as Richard explained his history with Rebecca, the pregnancy, and how he had only recently learned of Ethan's existence. "So, you're my real father?" Ethan finally asked, looking at Richard with an unreadable expression. "Biologically, yes," Richard answered carefully. "But your father, in every way that truly matters, is Louis. He chose you, cared for you, loved you from the very beginning." Ethan turned to Louis, whose eyes were brimming with tears. "Dad, you'll still be my dad, right?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "Always, son, always," Louis replied, hugging Ethan. Then the boy turned back to Richard. "And you, can I still call you Uncle Richard like always?" The question took Richard by surprise. He had expected anger, confusion, maybe even rejection, not this simple, straightforward acceptance so characteristic of Ethan. "Of course you can, Ethan. I'll always be your Uncle Richard." Samantha Baker's article was published 2 days later, but with a different angle than originally planned. Instead of a scandal about a businessman hiding an imperfect son, it became a touching story about two men from completely different worlds united by their love for an extraordinary child. The response was overwhelming. Richard received hundreds of messages, some criticizing him for not immediately claiming paternity, but most praising his respectful approach and current dedication to Ethan. Louis was hailed as an example of true fatherhood, transcending biological ties. And Ethan, to everyone's surprise, handled the sudden fame with impressive maturity. In an interview for a children's program, when asked what it was like to have two dads, he answered simply, "I'm lucky to have so many people who love me. My dad taught me that family is whoever takes care of you, no matter how they came into your life. And Uncle Richard teaches me about buildings and how to design homes where everyone can live well, even people like me." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers tremendously. Now continuing, the media exposure brought unexpected consequences. Several families with children in the same condition as Ethan began reaching out to Richard, seeking guidance about the treatment that had helped their son partially regain movement. In response, Richard decided to transform his private foundation into a broader institution, specifically focused on research and treatment for the rare neurological condition affecting Ethan. He hired the best specialists and established partnerships with international research centers. Louis, in turn, was invited to share his experience in a support group for adoptive parents of children with disabilities. His inspiring story about how a single man from humble origins fought for the right to adopt a child who had been returned touched many hearts and encouraged others to follow the same path. But the deepest transformation occurred in Richard. The man who had once lived solely for business and expanding his real estate empire now made time to attend his son's therapy sessions, help him with school projects, and simply be present. His old penthouse in the Upper East Side was sold, and he moved into an adapted apartment in the same complex where Ethan and Louis lived. A year after the public revelation, life had found a new balance. Ethan continued making progress in his treatment, now able to take steadier steps with crutches and using a wheelchair only for longer distances. His architectural sketches had evolved so much that he was invited to participate in a special mentorship program at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at Columbia University. On a particularly meaningful Sunday, Richard and Louis organized a small birthday party for Ethan at the adapted park near their complex. Only those closest to them were present. A few of Louis's co-workers, architects from Richard's firm who had become Ethan's mentors, his favorite teachers, and some school friends. During the party, Richard asked for a moment to make an announcement. "Since we're all gathered here, I'd like to share some news," he said, visibly emotional. "The New Steps Foundation, which we created to help children with the same condition as Ethan, has just received approval to begin construction on a treatment and research center here in New York City." There was enthusiastic applause, but Richard raised his hand to signal he had more to say. And there's more. The project was designed by a very special architect who understands firsthand the specific needs of these children. All eyes turned to Ethan, who smiled shyly. "Of course, Ethan is too young to be the official architect," Richard continued, "but his Home for Everyone concept was the foundation our professionals used. Every detail he envisioned was incorporated into the final design." The pride on Louis's face was indescribable. He, who had never had the opportunity to pursue higher education, now saw his son being recognized by some of the country's finest architects. "The center will be built on land that's been in my family for decades," Richard explained. "It's in Greenwich, surrounded by nature. The perfect place for the children's recovery and development. And there's one more surprise." Richard gave a signal, and two staff members brought out a large covered panel. When the cloth was removed, everyone saw the model of the future center, with astonishing details that clearly reflected Ethan's unique style. "The center will be named the Ethan Miller Thompson Institute," announced Richard, looking at the boy and then at Louis. "If you both agree, of course. I think it's time Ethan officially carries the names of both his fathers." The silence that followed was broken by Ethan, who stood up leaning on his crutches and with determination took several steps toward Richard. "Can I really have both names?" he asked, looking back and forth between Louis and Richard. "If that's what you want, son," replied Louis, moved. Ethan hugged Richard tightly, then turned and, with steadier steps than ever, walked to Louis to embrace him too. "You're both my dads. Both of you," the boy declared simply, but with a certainty that moved everyone present. The inauguration of the Ethan Miller Thompson Institute took place a year later, in a ceremony that brought together officials, medical specialists, families of children with the same condition, and even international representatives interested in the innovative model proposed. The center combined cutting-edge medical treatment with adapted educational spaces, areas for artistic development, and even a small architecture studio where children could explore their creative skills under professional guidance. On inauguration day, it was Ethan who cut the ribbon. With his crutches carefully set aside, and Louis and Richard each holding one of his arms, he took firm steps to the designated spot. The crowd held its breath when, upon arriving, Ethan gently let go of the two men's support and, for the first time in public, took 3 steps completely on his own to cut the ribbon. The ovation was deafening. Photographers captured the moment when Ethan, beaming with pride, was embraced again by his 2 fathers, who held him with tears in their eyes. The image of the 3, the construction worker, the businessman, and the boy who united them, became a symbol of a powerful message that family goes far beyond blood ties and that true love has the power to break down any barrier, whether physical, social, or economic. The institute quickly became a national benchmark. In the following years, hundreds of children benefited from the treatments developed there. Many, inspired by Ethan's example, discovered talents in fields they might never have explored without proper support. Louis eventually left his construction job to become the coordinator of the parent mentorship program at the institute. His experience and sensitivity made him perfect for welcoming and guiding families who arrived lost, with the same fear and uncertainty he had felt years before. Richard, in turn, completely restructured his business. His construction company, which had once focused only on luxury developments, now dedicated an entire division to inclusive architectural projects. With each new project, at least 20% of the units were fully adapted, following the principles initially developed by Ethan. The biggest transformation, however, was in his approach as a businessman. The man once known for his coldness and obsession, with results now prioritized the social impact of every project. His employees noticed the change, and the company's atmosphere evolved into something more human and welcoming. Ethan, growing up surrounded by so much love and encouragement, flourished in ways that surpassed all initial medical expectations. By age 12, he was already competing in national adaptive swimming competitions. His architectural sketches continued to evolve, now under the regular guidance of professors from Sapid Columbia. One ordinary afternoon, as the 3, Ethan, Louis and Richard, ate lunch together in the Institute's cafeteria after a particularly promising physical therapy session, Ethan asked a question that caught both men by surprise. "How do you think it would have been if we had met differently? If fate hadn't given us that little nudge?" Louis and Richard exchanged thoughtful glances. "I think we would have missed out on so much," Louis finally replied. "I'd still just be a construction worker, building houses I could never afford. And I'd still be a wealthy man, but empty," Richard added, "building an empire that meant nothing real." Ethan smiled, pleased with their answers. "I think it would have been sad for everyone. You two needed each other just as much as I needed you." The wisdom of that remark, coming from a 12-year-old, left both men momentarily speechless. Ethan was right. Louis had brought humanity and simplicity into Richard's life, transforming his worldview. Richard had given Louis opportunities and horizons he could never have reached alone. And Ethan, at the heart of this unlikely encounter, flourished with the best each had to offer. As the motto of the Institute, created by Ethan himself and inscribed on a plaque at the entrance, said, "Obstacles don't limit our dreams. They only force us to find new paths to achieve them." On a sunny Sunday morning, 2 years after the Institute's opening, a moment unfolded that would stay with the 3 of them forever. During a walk in the park, While Louis and Richard absent-mindedly discussed expansion plans for the center, Ethan quietly leaned his crutches against a bench. Without warning, he took one step, then another, and another, until he had taken 10 full steps on his own before calling out to them. "Dad, Uncle Richard, look!" When the two men turned, they saw Ethan standing alone, unsupported, his face glowing with triumph. Before they could react, he took 5 more steps toward them, slow but steady, until he fell into their open arms. It was a moment of victory that perfectly captured their journey, difficult but determined steps toward a future none of them could have imagined alone, but one they had built together. End of story. Dear listener, if this journey touched your heart, share with us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an encounter that changed lives? Leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us family is, above all, a choice of love.